throughout the scriptures, even when we get to the minor prophets, we can find God referring to Judah, even though Judah is dead and gone, and he's referring to the entire tribe of Judah. And in fact, it turns out that he can refer to the land as though it were the tribe. And the reason for that is when we look at the piece of land that it's sitting on, right? This piece of land that it's sitting on was here's the Jordan River, was given to the tribe of Judah, right? And since it was given to the tribe of Judah, I'll put it here, given to, or deeded to the tribe of Judah and all the families in that tribe. When he refers to Judah, he can be talking about the tribe itself. He can also be talking about the land that Judah has, the borders of the cities within the borders. So how are we going to deal with this fact that we have this odd way of referring to things? It would sound odd to us today, right? If someone were to name you America, right? If you were to say, America said to Germany, well, in a way you could do that, except, those aren't people's names. And in our world, we don't have anybody we would trust to represent us like that, right? We certainly wouldn't trust the president we have right now to represent all of us by his name. And the Germans wouldn't do that with their officials either. And the Russians wouldn't do it. Nobody on earth would do that now. So it's odd to us that it happens. But it's important for us to follow the turn of phrase to say, okay, I can acknowledge that there's a metonym that occurs here in the naming of the entire tribe by a single name. Now that means something happened behind the scenes, and the author made a careful choice. And the choice that the author made was to say, I am not going to give you the details of how this arrangement was made, because I think they're unimportant to the storyline. I think they would take too many words. Remember, I'll go back and say it again. Write 5 words, dip the pen. Write 5 words, dip the pen. Write 5 words. You wore yourself out doing that, right? So why put in details that were unnecessary? And the details that are unnecessary are, the leaders of this one tribe called a council with the leaders of the other tribe and sat down and explained the challenge they had ahead of them and got the agreement from the other tribe that they would allow their warriors to come and fight on behalf of the other tribe. And so they all went up together to conquer this piece of land. He doesn't want to give you all those details because in his mind, those things are completely unimportant. So instead he uses a metonym to shorten down all that nonsense behind the scenes to consolidate it down to a simple thing. So let's look at a couple of other ones, if we would, this evening. Chapter 1, Judges chapter 1 and verse 8. Now the children of Judah had fought against Jerusalem and had taken it and smitten it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Now, while we look at that one, let's go over to Joshua chapter 15. Should be back just a little ways. Joshua chapter 15 and verse 12. Joshua 15:12. And I'll read that one to you once I get to it. There we are. 15:12. And the west border was to the great sea, and the coast thereof. This was the coast of the children of Judah, round about according to their families. So I want you to see, as we look at these two passages, so we see that there was a border round about, and it says here in chapter 1, in verse 8, that the children of Judah had fought against Jerusalem and taken it. And the reason that I want you to see this is because I want you to see what looks like a generational skip. In fact, it looks like it skips more than one generation. Judah had long since passed away and had children who grew up in that 400 years in Egypt and had children, who grew up in that 400 years in Egypt and had children, who grew up in that 400 years in Egypt and had children, who wandered out into the desert for 40 years and died, but they had children, who are now going into the promised land. So we're probably at least 5 to 7 generations. I haven't bothered to count it, to be honest with you. Just looking at the 400 years plus the next 40 of them wandering around out there, we're probably looking at 5 to 7 generations of people between Judah and the people that are in the promised land, and yet they're referred to as the children of Judah. Now, I think it's illustrative for us, something we need to really think about. That when the Bible refers to someone as being your father, think of how the Pharisees said it. We have Abraham for our father. Really? He's even older than I thought he was. But what they don't directly mean, when we celebrated Father's Day, we all gathered around Abraham, right? When Dad had a barbecue, we went to Abraham's house, right? That's not what they're saying. They're saying we are the progeny of him some many generations back. And by saying that, we're acknowledging that we're his children. And we use the general term of children of to indicate that long-standing relationship. But it's important because you're going to find that used throughout the scriptures as well as a figure of speech representing the ultimate end of their ancestry line, how far they want to track back their ancestry line. I had an interesting experience that goes along with this that I think is interesting. When I was in the consulting world a number of years ago, I took my family with me on a trip because the consultant wanted me in Europe for a number of weeks, and I said, I won't come to Europe for a number of weeks alone. You'd have to bring my family or I'm not coming. Right? I'd go for a week, and then I'd go home for a week. Then I'd go back for a week, and I'd come home for a week. That's the way I structured the contract, because I'm not leaving my family for months at a time. So if you want me over here, you have to pay for my family to come. And they said, okay, we need you here really bad. We'll pay for your family to come. So they paid for my family to go over to Europe, and we went to England. And my family got on the subway when I was at work and the tube, and they went everywhere on the tube and the London Underground and on the buses and all over the place in London while I was working. And then the weekend came, and we decided to go to Paris. So we caught the Channel train, right? And we went under the English Channel at 150 miles an hour or whatever that is, right? And it was a blast. We got into Paris, not speaking a word of French. And we got off in Paris, and we had a hotel, and we had an idea what we were going to do. And so we looked up at the board, and I could not tell where I was going. I was staring up at that board. And there's a couple things you got to know. The first one is Michaela or at that time in her life anyway, had an uncanny ability to sound like anyone around her. So the longer we were in England, the more she sounded British. When we got to France and we're standing around in the Gare du Nord, the North train station, right? And we're standing around looking at things, Michaela's natural thing was just to start sounding French. She just sounded that way. And we'd only been standing there for like a few minutes, but she just did it, right? And there was no pretension with her. It was just who she was at the time. And so she could go up and talk to people, and they would talk to her, right? And so I'm like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I don't know where I'm going or how to get there or anything like that. And I'm looking up at this board. I don't know. Linda's like, well, didn't we plan something ahead about this? Yeah, I think I remember planning this thing, but none of this looks like what I was looking at online, and I just don't know how to read that board and get where we're going. So Michaela strikes up the conversation with this guy standing next to us, right? And he's speaking broken English, partial French, and she sounds like she's French, and she can understand him, and he seems to be able to understand her. And he finds out that the French look at their transportation system differently than the Brits do. The way the French look at their transportation system is the end destination. So you're not taking a northbound train to the city center. If the end of that line is 20 miles past the city and it's got a name out there, that's the name of that line. That's the destination of that line. They think about it according to the furthest point on that line, and that's how you know where to go. And so when you're looking at this board, you have to have a map in your mind that has some sense of what routes are along what, path to what end destination, or you're never going to get anywhere in this place. Right? Now, once you can twist your mind around that a little bit and think about it as being, I have to know the end, then you look at the map and you see it differently. Instead of seeing city geographical features or attractions like the Louvre, there's no Louvre stop or there's no Louvre line, right? And now when you're in London, if you're going to Spurgeon's Tabernacle, you're going to a part of the city that's called Elephant and Castle. And so you look for the line to Elephant and Castle. And there it is, named after that part of the city. The French don't do that. So if you twist your mind around this and you look at it, you start looking at it for the endpoints, and then you mark where you are and you trace a line from the endpoint inward and say, oh, we need that line. And it's actually not a bad way to do it. It's just very different. And I say that because I want us to understand that when we're looking at this, at the writing of Scripture, they had a similar kind of thought. Their thought was to look at this endpoint back here and to trace everything back to that endpoint. So I could be a child of Judah even though Judah had been buried for 400 years. And it was perfectly legitimate for me to say, Judah's my father. Or Abraham's my father if I want to look further back on that same line. And it's not cheating. And it's not somehow trying to deceive someone. There's no attempt to deceive. It's simply how we think about that map in our head of where the information lies. And that's how they point to it. And I say that because I think this is illustrative at this point, and just want to pick out the illustration and say, you got to watch out for that turn of phrase. So, chapter 1 and verse 11, the next verse. From thence he went against the inhabitants of Deber, and the name of Deber before was Kirjath Sepher. And the reason that I wanted to bring this one out is to note something here. And what I want you to note is that when he's giving this instruction, he's actually trying to give it for a targeted audience. He's a very smart writer. He's not going to write it for, he's not just writing it to record something. He's got an audience in his mind, and he's aiming to give that audience some information. And so the writer gives them the name of the city as they would be familiar with it, which is Deber. And then he notes, wasn't always called that. It was called something else before that. And oddly, when you look at its name before that, and you look at it, it is Kirjath Sepher. Kirjath is actually not a Hebrew word. It's actually a Canaanite word. Almost more, it's more Jebusite. And it means a city of, like a large city. Like the difference between, the city of San Antonio and a village somewhere. Or a town of some sort. And it gives it a sense of size. And so when he says, went against Deber, whose name was Kirjath Sepher, he's actually trying to tell you this was not a small place. This was one of those bigger cities that they had to go against. Okay? So, again, without analyzing the text, if we just looked at the text, we would say, oh, the city changed names. But actually, there's a little more to it than just the change of names. He's telling you this for a reason. It's good to know, good to analyze what that reason might be for a minute, right? Verse 12, the very next verse. And Caleb said, he that smiteth Kirjath-Sepher, and taketh it. To him will I give Asa my daughter to wife. And now notice what we're getting out of this. What was that place when he records this, saying, when another writer, whoever wrote the biography of Joshua, recorded this very same incident? What do we know about where this battle takes place? What is the geography of this city? It's in Joshua, yep. Joshua 15, 16, if somebody wants to go there. What do we know about the geography of this place? Let me do it this way. Would that be a good representation of the geography?
I don't know yet. The line you just drew, that line, right?
Yes, this line right here. Would that look like the geography? We have a song in our supplement that comes from this story of Caleb. I want that. I want that mountain. Why? Because the Lord gave it to me. And I know there are giants in it. So whoever goes and takes that mountain and kills those giants gets my daughter to wife. So he's not filling you in on all that detail. And he doesn't fill you in on that because he knows you already have it. Or you have a story of Caleb and the mountain and the taking of the mountain and the whole 9 yards that comes with that somewhere else. So he's just going to give you this piece of detail. That not only was it on a mountain, but it was a pretty significant sized city on that mountain. It was not a small city. Probably fairly well fortified, thinking of a city on a mountain, right? As you think about that, you might think, you can see the castle walls rising up off of a sheer cliff, so it would be hard to attack the city from that side. You might see a steep downhill on the backside of it where you could place embattlements and towers, so it would make it very hard to attack the city from that side. You might see a road coming up to it from one, so it would be very easy to control traffic flowing into the city. I mean, those are the kinds of things that when you think of a city on a mountain that you're going to need some help to take, that's a challenge to take, it's probably, but you don't necessarily see that if you're just passing the passage, right, the text. It's going to take a little digging to see it that way, okay? And then if we go to chapter 1 and verse 19, and the Lord was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. And they gave Hebron unto Caleb, as Moses said, and he expelled thence 3 sons of Anak. Now, as we look at that, could somebody read me Joshua 11, verse 14? Joshua 11, verse 14. Go ahead.
Wait, what are you reading?
14.
Yes.
Jephthah sent messengers against unto the king of the children of Ammon.
Joshua 11?
You,
Sorry, I'm in Judges.
you're in Judges. Joshua 11, 14.
Looks so.
No, I'm reading this.
No, go ahead, read it.
Go ahead.
And all the spoil of the cities and the cattle, the children of Israel set it for prey unto themselves. And every man they smote with the edge of the sword, until they had destroyed them. Neither left they any.
Now, notice this. Notice the 2 accounts, because they're parallel accounts. In one account, he says, we took all the cattle for prey, and we killed every man among them. We didn't leave a single one breathing. But the other account says this: the Lord was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron. In this case, we have them driving out, but in the other case, we have smitten with the edge of the sword and left none there to breathe. So which one is it? Because they don't sound like the same. Is it a contradiction? There have been many who thought it was a contradiction. They just declared it. Well, there's a contradiction in the Bible right there. In one passage, he clearly says they slew all the men with the edge of the sword. In the other passage, it says he drove them out. So which is it? Did they slay them or did they drive them out? Well, any ideas for me?
They slayed everybody in the city, and the ones that left were driven out.
Okay. All right, so let's look at it from that perspective for a second. Here's what you're saying. You're saying there's actually two sets of facts here that we're dealing with. One of them is a battle record, and the battle record needs to deal with how many enemy were there, how many were killed, and how many of our people were killed, and how many survived. That's the battle record, right? Because that's what we care about when we go to war is who lived and who died, and how many and who were they, right? What side did they belong to? That's the battle record. The other one is actually looking at a different side of the same record and saying, okay, so that's how many lived and died in that battle, but ignoring the people who died, what happened to everybody else? And the answer is, everybody else was driven out who didn't get killed. Now, it's not a contradiction if I think I'm looking at the same record or two different records of the same event. Put it that way. That's probably a better way to put it. Two different records of the same event. One record is written by a general reporting back and saying, here's what we did. We went against the city, and we fought against the city. And when we finally overcame the embankments, and we got up onto the mountain, anybody who was there and who was willing to fight, we killed everybody who was there who was willing to fight. We didn't leave a single enemy combatant alive. We took no prisoners, and we didn't leave a single one in that city alive. Okay, good. That's true. But it has nothing to do with how many people had lived in that city before. And the total number of people that were in that city might have been 10 times the number we killed. But when the battle started and the battle raged on badly enough, and they realized we're not going to win, they ran and left the soldiers in the city. Why did they leave the soldiers in the city? Why didn't the soldiers run? Any ideas? Let's draw it. Let's draw the picture for a second, right? So let's look at it this way. We see all these soldiers on the outside out here, right? Whole crowd of them, bunch of them out here. We see the soldiers on the inside, whole crowd of them, bunch of soldiers in here. And then we see a whole bunch of people. Right? Maybe 10 times as many as there are soldiers. And these people all run. The city is falling, let's leave. Why would you leave the soldiers behind? To slow these people down so they don't catch these people. You've got to leave somebody behind to slow down the enemy army so they don't overrun the women and children who are running out the backside. Right? The rest of the population out there who isn't running all that fast because they're not soldiers. These people. So, I need to have two records. I actually, having one record would be very hard to read that way. If the general got there and said, when we got to the city, we found a very large city. Perhaps it could hold 1 million people. Not however many, right? Let's say 1 million just for round numbers. It could hold 1 million people. And in that city, we found 10,000 soldiers. And we killed them all, wiped them out. The city was now empty of any that breathed. And we went home. Now, that's true, but it would leave you wondering, why are there 10,000 soldiers in a city that holds 1 million people? Where's everybody else? What do these guys do for a living, right? But when you get both sides of the record, it makes a lot of sense. So when I'm looking at this storyline coming up from Joshua through Judges, I'm looking at 2 records, not one. And in one record, I have a phrase that occurs more than once in the book of Joshua that might be interesting to follow. And that is what they did to the king. It said, they did unto the king of that city the way they had done to the king of Jericho. And so, if I'm looking at it from the same, if I can warp my mind back into the frame of mind of someone writing in that day, we've already seen that I could use the name of an ancestor for the name of a whole tribe. So if I said the king of, what am I referring to? Or what are the possibilities that I would be referring to? Would I be referring to the whole city? Probably not, though. Because if so, I would just give you the name of the city. They did to Salem what they did to Jericho. But if I say instead, they did to the king of Salem what they did to the king of Jericho, now what am I talking about? I'm probably talking about the government, the leadership, the political base. So that if I destroy the king, I have essentially destroyed the nation. Destroy the president and our Congress and our Senate and our Supreme Court, and you've destroyed America. Right? Because you've destroyed our government. Right? Now, please don't do that. I'm just saying, trying to put it into our sense. We're a democracy, so we don't think of it as we don't have a single representative head of our nation. And in those days, if you had a single representative head of your nation, the only people who could take over after that would be their progeny, right? The line of succession was kind of narrow, right? We have this big, long line of succession that goes all the way down, the vice president, president pro tem of the Senate, blah, blah, right? All that kind of stuff in our line of succession. So if you killed our president, our government would continue on. And therefore our country would continue on. For them, if you killed the king, that is, killed the house of the king, like if you were to say he killed Judah, and you meant the whole tribe of Judah, well, if I used that same reasoning, I said they killed the king with the edge of the sword, and I meant the whole family of the king, that's it. The country is done. They have no government anymore. So when I'm looking at that record that I find in the book of Joshua, I'm looking at the record of the destruction of nations, not necessarily the slaughter of all the people in the nation, because you didn't need to do that. What you really needed to do was dismantle the government and kill that. Then you took down the entire nation. And since everybody had fled, except the king and his family and the soldiers that are protecting the city and trying to slow you down from slaughtering the people, which they have no idea what your intent is. They're so scared of you. The angel of the Lord has been doing his job. The hornets have passed through. These people are all unsettled. They're all afraid of you. They're sure that you're going to wipe them off the face of the earth. And therefore, when they realize our city is about to fall, get all the women and children out of here, and the soldiers are going to stay behind and slow them down, and hopefully some of you can escape the edge of the sword. And you walk in, you kill the king and all the soldiers that are left in the city, and then you go home again. You have just destroyed that nation. There's nothing left. They have no hope. They have no leadership. They have no wise men. They have no counsel. They have no soldiers. They have no weapons. You've destroyed the nation, even though you may have only destroyed a handful of people by comparison. And I just want to point this out, because if you don't look at what he's saying in that whole figure of speech that he started the chapter in, when he set the tone for you in the chapter by calling out Judah and Simeon and setting the tone for this whole thing, if you don't see it, when you're reading through this, it sounds incredibly brutal. Unbelievable massacre of perhaps millions of people in the land. But if you take a moment to see what figures of speech is the author using and why is he using it that way, it becomes readily apparent that we have driven out most of the people, but not all. We have killed the government officials, so there is no more of that. Probably the priests in the temple. And we are now moving into this land, and it is ours, even though some of the inhabitants of the land still live there. We couldn't drive them out for various reasons. They had iron chariots, and we had no weapons that would be successful against them. Even though the Lord was on our side, we could not drive those people out. We drove some people out, and they returned later on to that city, and they dwell among us to this day. But we did do what the Lord wanted us to do. We destroyed the nations and their religions. Therefore, the book of Joshua can close and say, Joshua did all that the Lord had commanded him to do and left none of it undone. And yet, there are many Palestinians living in the land of Palestine among the Jews in the book of Judges who were driven out, some of whom returned later, some whom they could not drive out, and yet the truth is all the nations are destroyed. A must-see in the figures of speech. And I went through this whole thing with you because before we leave the figures of speech, I wanted us to see how powerful they were. They're not just word pictures that help you see in your mind what he's trying to describe. They are that, but they're far more than that. They're a way to take a lot of information, including context and perspective, and distill that or pack that, squeeze that information down into a few words on the page so that you're not redundant and long and silly sounding when you try to give all this detail, because you've packed it all in this way. And if we can just take the time to ask ourselves what the structure of the passage is about, why the author would have structured it that way for us, we can unpack that meaning back out of those figures of speech. And it hands us a full truth that we would otherwise miss if we went over it. And we might assume there was a contradiction there when in fact there wasn't one. The contradiction was entirely in our understanding, but not actually in the text at all. And that's where we'll leave it for this week. Next week, what I'd like to pick up with is what's called the mention principles. The mention principles. It's another way to do a literary device, and I won't go into it tonight, but we'll get into that next week, and we'll start talking about how mentions occur in the scriptures. And that is, I'll give you the quick summary of it. That is, how does an author introduce a subject, attach meaning to it, and then carry that subject through their writing? How does an author introduce a subject, attach meaning and context to it, and then carry that subject through their writing? And you might think that's easy and obvious. You might think, well, you would just say it. But in fact, it makes very boring reading if you do it that way. You're not a very good author if you just come out and say, and let me tell you this, and let me put it into this context for you so that you can see and understand. You're a whole lot better author if you introduce it in little pieces, almost as a side fact in the story, and then you do what's called development along the way. And we'll look at how that works the next time we come together, next week. Lord willing.
Give us about the audio.
What's that?
Give us about the audio.
Yeah. Did the audio work?
Yes, I fixed it.
Okay, so the audio worked. Good. Then if you're online and you're watching right now, please remember to like the video, share it with your friends. Sorry we had some technical difficulties tonight. Hopefully we'll get those ironed out in future editions. We'll move on from there. Look to see you next week. Thank you very much.